But you have an easier job than I have.
Anyway. Yeah, probably, but not as much experience as you have.
Yeah, I think let's see how it goes.
Okay, I'm gonna go broadcast.
Okay.
Thank you.
So good afternoon, good evening, or even good morning to wherever you are joining us here from today. I'd like to welcome you to this SAIS webinar organized by the Student Government Association of SAIS and hosted by the Bologna Institute for Policy Research, BIPR. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Alessandra Nakamu and my colleagues in the student government who have put in effort into realizing this online event. Of course, like so many things these days, this was planned to be an in-person event, but we'll hope to usefully be able to substitute the personal interaction in this online format as well. We are very delighted and honored to have with us here today Mr. Alfiaz Vaiya. He served as the coordinator of the European Parliament Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup. He has previously worked in the Secretariat and was a project manager for Human Rights Without Frontiers. He has led countless cross-party initiatives in his capacity as coordinator to promote diversity and equality, and has advanced key policy initiatives like the Common European Asylum Framework and the Employment Equality Directive, to only name a few. Mr. Vaiya has been recognized by the Obama Foundation as one of the key young emerging European leaders. He has been awarded the prestigious Marshall Memorial Leadership Fellowship and is currently working on transatlantic relations. He is a true leader and expert in his field, so we're very glad to have him with us here today. He's going to talk about racism and discrimination in Europe and how they impact multilateral international governance, but also our democratic societies. We look forward to the talk. It's going to be around 15 to 20 minutes, after which you will have the opportunity to pose any questions you may have. You're welcome to do so in the Q&A chat, the button of which you can find on the bottom of the screen, and I'll then relay the question to Mr. Vaiya. So without further ado, thank you for being here with us today. I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Moritz. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to come and speak today by webinar to discuss about this important issue that I've been working on for the past few years. I'm going to give the context is very much going to focus on Europe. It's where my expertise is. I've worked in the European Parliament, and I want to talk about how racism and discrimination are being used by certain EU member states, political parties, and third countries, so countries outside of the European Union, who are using racism and discrimination to achieve political power and to further their policy aims. I want to move away from the discourse around racism and discrimination only being morally wrong, but actually pose racism and discrimination as security threats that actually pose threats to our security and to our democracy. And actually, why we need to have an urgent response to combating racism and discrimination is not only for the moral reasons, but also because of security and democracy implications. And why is it important? Well, parties who engage in racism or discrimination, they do not only mobilize their supporters to vote, but they also manage to create damage by creating distrust in society. A lot of marginalized communities, people from marginalized communities, stop believing in society and actually move away from society and actually don't engage in democratic process. And actually that serves another purpose for these political movements because they demobilize the opposite supporters. And so first of all, I want to talk about the current background of what's happening in Europe or in the world, then focus on why the EU is being targeted, and then third, talk about how racism and discrimination are being used as tools and are security threats and pose threats to our democracy. So first of all, we see across the world a rise in global populism. We see an attack on multilateralism, and we see an attack on the Bretton Woods institutions, which were created after World War II. And we're also seeing at this time a breakdown in transatlantic relations, and also we're seeing division within Europe. We're seeing all of this happen at an accelerated pace, and this is causing a lot of problems, but also means that we're seeing new partnerships and relationships being built, and we're seeing a realignment within the European Union, but also a realignment in geopolitical relationships, and also a realignment in the EU's southern and eastern neighborhoods. So we see a lot of different things happening in a very quick space of time, which means that it provides opportunities for people and for countries outside of the EU to manage to achieve their political ambitions and aims. So why is it that the EU is being targeted? Well, the European Union is being targeted because of its support for multilateralism and for democracy, rule of law, and human rights. The EU has remained committed to these principles of multilateralism, of democracy, of rule of law, and human rights, whilst we see others globally moving away from that multilateralism and those principles. And for a lot of third countries, Eurosceptic member states and political forces are working together to weaken the European Union. So the European Union cannot be as effective in promoting multilateralism, democracy, rule of law, and human rights. And these third countries, the Eurosceptic member states and political forces, they want to concentrate power and undermine multilateral institutions. But why? And I think this is an important thing to look at. We see that they want to do this because they want to gain power and rewrite the rules. This can already be seen within the European Union institutions, which have become paralyzed on issues such as financial irregularity, anti-democratic reforms, rule of law, and human rights. We see how certain member states, by gaining power, have managed to push back against the European Union from being able to promote an agenda that focuses on combating financial irregulation, promoting democracy and rule of law. For third countries, their purpose is to undermine the EU's soft and normative power and its ability to project its influence. We see that destructive global power games are being played and the EU's voice has become irrelevant. We see that whether it's in eastern Ukraine, in Syria, in Libya, in Iran, or in Palestine, we see that actually the EU has become very much in the margins. And so we see why third countries outside of the European Union, are keen to target the European Union because they want to weaken the European Union from within inside, to prevent the European Union from being able to project its normative power, its soft power. And so what we're seeing right now is we're seeing a vacuum, and we're seeing that the EU is paralyzed, both within the European Union in trying to combat some of the the anti-democratic reforms, corruption that certain member states are guilty of. But also at the same time, we see that the EU has become paralyzed in terms of promoting and projecting a foreign policy, its foreign policy, and its foreign policy aims. So that is the kind of situation we're seeing. And I want to focus on how racism and discrimination are actually being used to further the aims of particular member states, particular political parties, and third countries. And we're seeing how racism, discrimination have been used to scapegoat and distract people from what is happening. Power is being used to politicize and manipulate. And what I keep on saying is that we should be looking at racism and discrimination within the security lens, and not only as a moral imperative to fight. We should be looking at how racism and discrimination are affecting us in terms of security. And what we do see is that we see that racism and discrimination are causing polarization and division in society. Populist and Eurosceptic political parties, particular member states, are fully aligned on issues such as third country migration, anti-Islam rhetoric, and issues on gender and sexual orientation. And actually on these particular issues, whether it's third country migration, so that's migration from outside of the European Union, or anti-Islam rhetoric, or issues around sexual orientation and gender, we actually see this is where you see the strongest alignment amongst political forces, amongst Eurosceptic political forces, particular third countries, and particular member states. We don't see that same alignment on economic issues. We see that some of those movements or some of those political parties and member states are very much, some of them support neoliberal economic policies, whilst others are a bit more populist in the economic thinking. So where we see the main kind of alignment, we see the alignment on issues around third country migration, anti-Islam rhetoric, and on issues around gender and orientation. And the main point that they want to do is cause distrust among citizens. They want to mobilize their supporters and demobilize or sow distrust in others. They do this through preying on people's fears, questions around who holds power and who doesn't, also issues around changing demographics, playing on those fears of citizens, of European citizens, about what is happening, and playing on people's concerns and fears that they have around changing of how society is changing, whether it's through globalization, through increasingly changing demographics, and playing on these real fears that people have in society. And it enables populists and Eurosceptic political parties to win elections. And I give you an example of here in Poland, where actually if you see the last two general elections in Poland, you see that actually in both elections, the ruling party, the current governing party, had used a particular minority group and politicized the issue. So in the general election that happened around 4 years ago, the issue was very much about Islam and the Muslim invasion into Europe, and how that particular political party, Law and Justice, were fighting for a Christian Europe and fighting against the invasion from Muslims. Now, fast forward to 4 years later and to last fall, where we saw another general election in Poland, where we saw actually Law and Justice this time target LGBTI people and issues around gender, and made that the threat, and said that the biggest threat to Poland is LGBTI issues and equality. And actually what they were doing was playing on the fears of people in society, first of all, when it came to the perceived threat of a Muslim invasion, and then more recently about the threat in terms of gender and the threat, to family by a homosexual agenda. And so basically they were using racism and discrimination to achieve political power, so that they can use that political power to then further their own political objectives. And it enabled them to win elections. And you see what's happened in Poland happen in many other EU member states. Poland is not the only member state, but you see that across, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, you see those tactics around Islam and around sexual orientation and third country migration very much being at the fore of political discourse. And you also see that there is some kind of collusion with third countries. So we're seeing very sophisticated disinformation campaigns by third countries, which also play on these fears that citizens may have. So we see that the political parties and certain governments are working directly with third countries like Russia to engage in propaganda and disinformation around the issues of Muslims, around sexual orientation and gender, and around third country migration, all to create this situation of fear and to play on people's concerns. And so that's one part of it, what we're seeing happen today. But on the other part, what we're also seeing is, because of the rise of these political parties and these member states and these particular groups, what we're also seeing is that marginalized communities are actually becoming more and more isolated and alienated. And that is part of the other process of what we're seeing happen, which is that we're seeing one group of citizens becoming mobilized on these issues, and another group of citizens actually becoming alienated. And now what that leaves is a vacuum in society, which actually is being used by third countries for their own agenda. And we see that happening. If you look at the 2016 US general election, we actually saw a sophisticated disinformation campaign by Russia that targeted minorities. So Russia was actually creating propaganda and content actually targeted towards minorities to prevent them from voting, to create the disenfranchisement, to create this illusion that politics in America was against marginalized communities. So we saw it happening the other way around. And we saw how Russia used that to its advantage to suppress the vote, to suppress the democratic vote, whilst also at the same time running a disinformation campaign that tried to energize the vote, the vote on the right. So we saw Russia playing a double game, and we're seeing that happen in Europe as well, because we're seeing that on the one hand we're seeing a mobilization of particular voters, and on the other hand we're seeing a campaign, a disinformation campaign that targets particular people and groups in society to prevent them from voting, to create distrust. And basically, that's created a whole vacuum in our society, which is becoming very dangerous. And actually, it's something that I think that we need to see how we can tackle. We need to see how we can offer policies that can combat racism and discrimination, and actually start to view it not in terms of a moral lens, but also in terms of a security lens. That actually what we're seeing happen, we're seeing that how racism and discrimination are some of the tools that are being used by particular member states, by particular political parties, and by third countries to achieve political power, but to achieve also their political aims, which is to disrupt and target the European Union, and also prevent the European Union from being able to act. And I think that, and we're seeing that happen today. We're seeing that distrust definitely play out, because we're seeing a lot of people who have stopped believing in the European Union's ability to act, whether that's on domestic issues, in terms of rule of law, democracy, but also financial corruption, EU funding going to particular member states, but also in terms of the EU's ability to project itself globally. We're seeing that the EU has become irrelevant on a lot of issues, and it's actually being bypassed as we see new political partnerships happening in terms of geopolitics. And for me, these are very worrying issues, because I don't think we've fully understood exactly how these threats are how these threats are happening, but also how sophisticated, or how the political parties in third countries and particular member states are actually engaging in very clever campaigns to promote their politics and to promote their to achieve their aims. And I think that's what we need to be looking at more closely, is seeing how they're working together to create this distrust and division in society. And actually, I think one of the first ways we can do that is by looking at targeting, seeing how we can promote policies that actually promote diversity and inclusion, and actually try to become a bit more aggressive, that is the European Union becoming more aggressive in terms of combating some of these issues. I think I'll leave it there for now, if there's any questions.
Okay, thank you so much thus far. I think I will kick off the Q&A session with 1 or 2 questions. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and then Mr. Vaiya can answer them. So you made an argument about how political parties can exploit discrimination or sentiments of racism within society, and they clearly can draw political gain from that. I'd sort of be interested in, where does this come from? So why do people follow these parties? Is there an inherent potential for a sympathy towards discrimination or racism in almost all democratic Western societies? Is that an inherent feature, or is that something that is interlinked with the supply, so with the parties who actually do propose these policies?
So I think it's a mixture of things. I mean, there is clearly some part of the electorate that, you know, is very interested and agrees with a lot of these politics, right? But actually, I believe that the vast majority of people who vote for these political parties actually don't agree with the racism or discrimination, but they're led to believe through these campaigns that actually it's the fault of minorities, or that minorities pose a threat. So they've actually, you know, become, they've been very much caught up in the propaganda, and actually, you know, started to believe that propaganda. But actually, I don't think that they are so in line with that obvious racism and discrimination. I mean, I would hope, and having worked across Europe on these issues, I think it's genuinely an issue of people having concerns around belonging and concerns around the future. We're not offering people a vision for the future. The European Union is not offering something that is concrete, or offering a vision that, you know, people can buy into. Right? If you see some of these political parties, third countries, the disinformation that's coming, it is material that is very very seductive, in the sense that, you know, people can engage with it, that people can actually believe it, and people can actually see something, and it paints a picture for them, and people can actually see what's happening. And the problem we're seeing right now is that the European Union is kind of a bit lost in terms of messaging, in terms of how it's approaching these issues, and how it's actually creating content and information for citizens, and also selling what it's doing. I think the EU hasn't, you know, been able to sell its achievements in a way that actually makes people believe in a vision of the future. And I think that's what we need to do better. And I think that's what we're seeing with the populist political parties, with certain Eurosceptic member states, that they are building this vision, and they are creating this vision that people can buy into.
Okay.
And I would also say that that same problem applies to the vision that minorities or marginalized communities are seeing in Europe. I, as someone who comes from a minority background, I also don't see what the EU is offering to me. So I become disenfranchised. I also start to lose interest in contributing and being part of that society. And that also then exposes some other problems, which is then people who are on the edges, on the periphery of society, they can also be at the risk of then, you know, being targeted by people, what we've seen recently in Europe, when it comes to ISIS propaganda and other material, that we see that those people also become corrupted or start to believe the propaganda that's coming from extremists from the other side. And actually then that creates that dual problem of a huge division and polarization in society. And it makes it very difficult to then be able to articulate a vision for everyone in society.
Yeah, I think you made a striking point when you said that the EU sometimes is perceived as, or perhaps lacks a vision, and that many people turn to their national governments. Now we'll move to some questions by the audience. I would like to ask you, I forgot to say that before, I would like to ask you to mention your name, maybe where you study, your program, and what you're focusing on, so I can quickly introduce you to Mr. Vaiya. So one of the questions has been, are you aware of what are the examples of propaganda material that has proliferated in the European Union due specifically to Russian interference?
Well, I mean, it's been pretty clear. I mean, if you look at the 2019 European elections, Alfiaz had, the campaign organization, had produced a report on electoral, on disinformation and electoral interference. And they clearly showed a lot of evidence and they put a lot of research into finding content that was created by Russian bots aimed at European citizens. What is also very smart and what we've seen Russia actually do is Russia has actually changed its tactic. So if you actually look at, and this is where the best example is the US general election in 2016, a lot of the propaganda and disinformation was coming from Russian bots. If you compare that to the European election in 2019, actually, Russia was just amplifying content that was created by European citizens, making it more difficult for us to be able to counter Russian disinformation because the content was being created by European citizens, and all Russia was doing was amplifying it. So there's been a difference in how Russia has changed its tactics from a couple of years ago to now. And we have seen Russian content, disinformation content in Europe around Muslims, around third country migration, around LGBTI people and gender issues, targeting those issues of, family, of society, of demographics. We do have concrete examples of Russian disinformation on those issues. Likewise, we also see Russian disinformation aimed at minority communities, and actually, creating particular websites, pages on Facebook, accounts on Twitter that actually, engaging in content that actually would appeal to minority voters, engaging in content about racism in society, about rising Islamophobia. So Russia playing a double game. One, disinformation towards a particular group of people in society that's focused on the threat of third country migration, sexual orientation rights, on Muslims, and then on the other side, focusing on content that is looking at showing or amplifying issues around racism to discourage people from voting and discourage people from taking part in society. I can send some links afterwards by email of concrete examples of Russian disinformation in Europe.
Okay, we also have a sort of follow-up question to that one. What has been the reaction of European state actors to this Russian interference, and what has, broadly speaking, been the reaction of the public?
Well, I mean, I think this is where you see it actually all play out. I mean, so what you see is a division in the European Union. We see that the European Union is divided. We see that certain member states who benefited from Russian disinformation and propaganda of course, they don't want to take action. So it's very difficult for the EU to come up with a response to Russian disinformation, just because you see that division in society. And that goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, that actually the purpose of this racism and discrimination and these disinformation campaigns is to create this division in society so that third countries like Russia can then take advantage of this vacuum in governance. And the EU has also been very reluctant or scared to run, aggressive campaigns, towards aggressive campaigns against Russia in terms of combating disinformation. So the EU has set up a small office to counter Russian disinformation, but it's more kind of, the approach is, it's more reactive than proactive. We haven't really thought about how we can engage and in a proactive way in combating Russian disinformation and propaganda. And I think that's the biggest concern, is that the response has been very weak. And I think amongst general citizens, I think citizens are not so well aware of what they're seeing online and how it can be disinformation or how it can be fake news, and who's responsible for creating that content. I think we're still a long way to go in terms of educating citizens about content online. The situation has also changed. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, when we had content that was, print-based content or video content that, was broadcast content, it could be controlled. Everything was checked and, everything was controlled. Now with, online platforms and video sharing platforms, we just don't have the same ability to check content, which means that it's difficult to be able to deal with the disinformation and propaganda that's coming. And I think that's one of the biggest issues that we need to see. And we need to start to educate. In my role, I spent a lot of time, with marginalized communities, communities of color, speaking about how they should be able to recognize fake news and disinformation, looking at a particular kind of rules or points that, they can always consider every time before they share anything online, creating a toolkit for them to know and to spread in their communities about recognizing content. And I think people are slowly becoming aware about this disinformation and about propaganda, but I think there's still a lot to do.
Yeah, the entire topic of disinformation certainly is also very relevant in light of the present crisis. The next question that we've received refers to pluralistic parties in the European Union. I take it that it means mainly pro-European parties that constructively engage on a European level. Why are so many of them struggling at the moment? And do you think that the EU has a communication problem?
Well, I mean, I think the EU definitely has a communication problem. I think that is for sure. I mean, the EU is clearly hasn't been able to sell its achievements or its relevance today. But I think if you're looking at if you're looking at the point of why pluralistic parties, pro-European parties, as you say, why they are struggling is because I think that they keep on switching the narrative. So rather than having their own narrative, they just follow on or feed from the narrative that's been created by the extremes of society. We see that both with the traditional social democratic parties and with the Christian Democrat parties, that they haven't been able to create a narrative, and actually their narrative just follows on from either what is being promoted by the far left or the far right. And actually that they're using their politics to guide their politics. And actually what I've been saying is that we should actually be trying to create our own narrative and actually stick true to our principles and our values. Both the center left, the Social Democrats, and center right Christian Democrats have been guilty of engaging in populist and populist politics and populist policies that actually are causing some of the problems we've seen. You can see that in Slovakia with the Social Democrats in Slovakia, who for a long time had very had encouraged far-right political views, had focused on, preventing a Muslim migration into Slovakia. And of course, you see it with political parties like Fidesz in Hungary, which is a Christian Democrat party, which has been also engaging in the same kind of campaign. And actually, the problem we're seeing is that there hasn't been much action taken by their political families in terms of trying to combat these political parties from pushing these political views. And I think that's what the biggest concern is right now. What we're seeing in Europe is that actually both the center left and center right haven't taken action against political parties in their own families, but haven't been able to create their own narrative, just like the European Union. And they always tend to be reactive rather than proactive in setting the agenda. And I think that's why there needs to be a big discussion. And I do think that, this discussion the European Union is having right now on the future of Europe is important and vital in terms of going forward, in terms of what does the future of Europe look like, and how can we start to create policies that are relevant to European citizens so that we can improve our policies and policymaking for the future and actually have more citizens that come on board with our policies.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a follow-up question on that one. Much of the European integration process has been underpinned by more or less tacit consensus on more Europe, or on a basic understanding that European integration is a beneficial factor in politics. This seems to have gone now. Is this a factor in the fact that traditional parties are struggling, that labeling the EU as a peace project and referring to all the historical successes that it had is simply not enough?
Yeah, it's simply not enough because we've moved forward from that. I mean, the biggest in the United Kingdom, one of the biggest selling points of the Brexit campaign, the Remain campaign, was that the European Union has delivered peace on the European continent, and it's been responsible for the coming together of European nations rather than European nations fighting with each other. But actually, I think we need to move on, and we should have realized that after 2008 and the financial crisis, because that narrative no longer holds. We're seeing we saw high youth unemployment, high unemployment in society, huge levels of debt. We saw people without jobs, and that narrative of the European Union being a peace project and bringing nations together just didn't hold anymore, because people had very real concerns about their livelihoods, about feeding their families, about their future career, about the future prospects. And that's where the far right and populist parties managed to become successful, especially those on the right, because they managed to frame those concerns into policies that are easy to understand. So if you had concerns around economic concerns, it was easy to blame third country migrants taking good jobs. Or if you had concerns around the future, you could also then throw in issues around family and belonging. And so the far right and populist parties were able to use that vacuum and use that moment to become relevant to the voters. And the problem was that the European Union plus the traditional center-right and center-left political parties were not able to create a narrative that was tangible or relatable to citizens and citizens' concerns, apart from the narrative of the European Union being a great project for peace. And actually, this is what I think we should, and I wonder how it will be post-COVID, is what will the narrative be after we come out of this crisis? How do we see the European Union moving forward, and how do we see center-left and center-right political parties and liberal parties, the center, creating a narrative that will be able to compete with populist, far-right, far-left political parties? We will have a lot of the same issues that we had after the financial crisis. A lot of the same economic scars, a lot of the same economic problems. On top of that, we'll have a lot of social problems because of the enforced lockdowns. And so we already know how the populists, especially the populists on the right, will react, which is that we know they will just engage in even stronger politics of blaming migrants, of engaging, in these kind of discriminatory campaigns. But what will be the response of the moderate liberals, center right, center left, and the European Union? what will be that vision, that narrative that we can create and that people can trust, especially those people who won't have jobs, who suffered economically and socially. What will be our narrative? And that has been my concern watching the EU's response, that the EU's response has been weak to COVID, already with in terms of support to Italy at the beginning, but then during the crisis. And now, what will the response be after the crisis? I'm not so confident that the EU will be able to create a response that will be able to compete with the populists.
So we have another question from the audience. It also concerns public opinion and what tools are we able to use? What tools can we use to measure the public's opinion of the EU?
I mean, there are always the Eurobarometer polls, which which show people's perceptions and opinions of the EU and different issues. I think we can also look at the European elections as a good barometer. Of course, people haven't been engaged in European elections for a long time, but although in the last European election we saw the general percentage go up in terms of voters, we saw an increase for the far right and for populist parties, and that clearly shows that there is a strong Euroscepticism in society. And the fact is that we are seeing across Europe, and we have seen across Europe, the rise of far right or far left political parties into governing positions, whether either leading governments or in coalitions. If you look at Syriza in Greece, a far left party that was leading government in Greece for 4 years, or if you see in Austria or in other countries where you see the far right has been in a coalition government, you see that there is a very strong Euroscepticism out there, and you see there is fatigue amongst the electorate in terms of believing in the European Union project. And so that's important also because you see that in terms of the rise of the far right parties, but you also see that a lot of people coming from marginalized communities, a lot of voters, young voters, who are pro-EU, they've also become disenfranchised by politics. They've also become tired of of seeing the European Union not reacting, not taking more action against Hungary, taking more action against Poland for anti-democratic measures. You also see, communities like that I've worked with, who just completely don't believe in the political system because they don't believe that their vote counts for anything. The amount of times I've spoken with Muslim, Roma, Black communities who say that there's no point of voting because nothing changes. And actually, what happens is we see that the campaigns or the propaganda that is xenophobic or racist actually increases. And so we're not actually even giving those people, any opportunities to go out and vote. We're not making them feel as though they belong or they vote. So both things are happening at the same time. We're seeing that the far right and populists and far left are mobilizing and energizing their supporters. But at the same time, we're seeing that minorities and pro-Europeans are actually, being demobilized and actually, moving away from the political process and not engaging anymore. So it's going to be a difficult thing of how to respond to that for the European Union. I just hope that the European Union actually manage to take a firm stand and actually, engage in open, liberal policies that are internationalist, and I think if they start to do that, they will actually see a lot of people will start to come back and vote. And we need to see that leadership from the top. We need to see that from the European Commission President, from the College of Commissioners, but also from the heads of states of different EU member states. We need to see that leadership. And the one thing I would say here is that apart from COVID, we're going to see a very difficult time for the EU in the next couple of years, because we're also going to see a power vacuum at the top. Angela Merkel is supposedly going to, stop being the chancellor and, leaving her position. So we're going to miss her in terms of what she brings to the table, and in terms of the trust people have in Angela Merkel. But we're also going to see that Emmanuel Macron, his attentions are going to change, because he's going to have to deal with a domestic general election where his main opposition is going to be the far right, Marine Le Pen. So we're going to see an absence of leadership, of European leadership at the top. And it's unfortunate that, the European Union they agreed that Ursula von der Leyen would be the European Commission president, Charles Michel, the European Council president, both of whom do not have that same gravitas or same kind of, are not so well known amongst the population, and do not inspire or inspire confidence or trust amongst the population. So, it's going to be a very interesting time, and alongside Brexit happening at the same time, about what happens next, because you have COVID, you have Merkel, the transition from Merkel to another chancellor, you have the French general election, and then you have Brexit. It's going to be an interesting time for the European Union, and potentially a very dangerous time, because there might be a huge political vacuum and a leadership vacuum.
Yeah, I think you're touching a very important point when you talk about EU leadership. I mean, considering the intergovernmental institutions that we have that are constantly in flux because of a changing composition. If we think about how Ursula von der Leyen, the current Commission president, was chosen rather than the lead candidates of the two top competing parties, I think that's a very valid point. We have a question from Kim Jasmine. She's a colleague of mine, also a student in Bologna. She's concentrating in Latin American studies. Her question concerns leadership in Europe. So she's asking, who can we turn to? Who is a good example in combating racist and discriminatory rhetoric in the European Union, either nationally or maybe also supranationally? And what policies have they implemented? Yeah.
Yeah, it is a difficult one to answer. I mean, in terms of political parties, we've seen how the Green Party across Europe have managed to energize the electorate. Managed to make themselves in a position where they can become successful by promoting, pro-European liberal internationalist policies, and actually being very much switched on with the concerns of citizens and of the youth. And so I think the Greens across Europe, especially in Germany, are a good example of a political party which seems to understand how to form a narrative, how to create a vision that is appealing, and that's evident in terms of its voter share, its increase in voter share, and its prominence at the European level in the European Parliament, and how seriously it's been taken by different political in terms of the Greens have become more. The Greens are being listened to more and are being taken seriously by the political parties which were shunning them before. And I think that's because because people are starting to realize that the Greens are actually representing a voice in Europe, and are actually, a credible voice in Europe, and a legitimate voice in Europe. In terms of governments, or in terms of political leadership, it is difficult to point to any kind of political leadership in Europe that is engaging or is doing well. You could look at Portugal in terms of the Portuguese government, having very good policies when it comes to migration, inclusion, diversity. But even then, you see issues in Portugal. You see that Portugal is a different situation to other European member states. It doesn't have necessarily the same issues around xenophobia and racism. You also see that there is no political party in Portugal that is engaging in this right-wing, racist, xenophobic politics. A good example, one good example could be the president of Slovakia. She was recently elected, last year, and she was elected on a pro-European, open, liberal platform that is very much supportive of migrants, of Muslims, of sexual and reproductive rights. So that was a good positive to see in Slovakia. Even at the European elections, her political party managed to get 4 seats, which is a considerable amount of seats for Slovakia. So that shows that it can be done in different countries. The worrying thing is that we don't have too many examples that I can give to you. And actually, one of the worrying parts that I've noticed is that if you look at Denmark, you have a government that is social democrat liberal, but is actually engaging in some of the most racist, discriminatory policies that we're seeing in Europe, especially when it comes to migration. And so actually, that's a worrying thing that a center-left social democratic party and a liberal party are actually enacting policies that we would associate with the far right or with populists. And so that is rather worrying to see, and that's happening across Europe. We're seeing that a lot of even social democratic parties are following the trend of the Danish Social Democrat Party in engaging in these kind of policies that you normally associate with the right.
Okay, we have another question by Kim Jasmine. She's asking more of a personal question to your career. So she's asking your office, I think she means your intergroup in the European Parliament. How were you interacting with domestic parties in different EU member states?
So our intergroup I don't work there anymore, but the Intergroup is a cross-party initiative. So it has members of the European Parliament from across the political spectrum. And of course, those members come from political parties. So we were working with political parties through their members of European Parliament. And a lot of the work we were trying to do was around inclusion, diversity, trying to increase representation of minorities on political lists. Because we believe that actually if you have more representation, you'll have better policy making, but also people from minority backgrounds will believe more in the process if they see more people like them in the political process. And they see people in leadership who look like them. And that will encourage them to go out and vote. So we were working a lot with political parties and members of European Parliament to see how we can make their political list more inclusive and try to have more minorities feature on their political list. We were also trying to work with them in terms of the election manifestos, trying to see how we can contribute in terms of policies that they would like to put in their manifesto in terms of combating racism and discrimination, and also trying to look at how we can improve their understanding of racism and discrimination. What we've really tried to do, or at least what we tried to do towards the end of my time at the Intergroup, was really move away from the moral issue and the economic issue around diversity and inclusion to the security issue. Because we realized that when you talk about moral issues, when it comes to being morally right about combating racism and discrimination, it wasn't getting through to the electorate. When you're framing it in terms of economic issues, in terms of an aging demographic in Europe, a huge burden that we're going to see on our social welfare systems, and the fact that we need more migration if we are to improve productivity, have consistent economic growth, and to become innovative economies, we need to have more migration. Wasn't getting through to the electorate because the electorate cares about what's happening now, and they couldn't see that opportunity cost of having more migration right now, which would bring long-term economic benefits. So what we focused a lot was on actually changing the narrative to the security narrative and talking about the threats that racism and discrimination pose to democracy and to rule of law and to human rights, and actually how racism and discrimination are being used by particular member states, by particular political parties, and by third countries to further their aims in society and to further their aims in terms of geopolitics. And I probably just want to bring in an issue there when it comes to the issue of Islamophobia. So in Europe, there has been a reluctance from the political leadership to combat Islamophobia because they've been worried about looking as though they're providing too much support to Muslim communities or providing funding to combat Islamophobia. I've been there and I've worked a lot and seen that, European policymakers are very scared to even talk about the issue of Islamophobia because they're worried about the electorate and worried that it's going to be unpopular with the electorate. But what this has allowed is countries like Turkey and other countries in the Middle East to manage to take advantage of that vacuum and to manage to work with Muslim communities in Europe and play on this isolation and this alienation that Muslim communities are facing in Europe. And we're seeing how Turkey has used that, especially when it comes to the sizable Turkish population in Germany and in Austria and in Belgium, where a lot of people are taking their instructions, especially those who come from a Turkish background, are taking a lot of instructions and a lot of advice that is being disseminated by the Turkish government. And the reason why Turkey has been able to be effective at that and been able to do that is because there's been an absence of leadership and an absence of support for the Muslim community in Europe. And how does that then affect what's happening? Well, actually, it benefits Turkey because, Turkey can keep on pushing back against the European Union and against EU member states on the issue of Islamophobia, can keep on, raising it as a political issue, the issue of migration, which then helps Turkey to be able to deflect questions about what's happening inside of Turkey in terms of the increasing authoritarianism of President Erdogan. So basically, Turkey has seen an opportunity there because of our failed actions when it comes to doing outreach and supporting the Muslim community. And Turkey has come in and swooped in and, managed to provide that support and resources to the Muslim community, but then use that for its political advantage. And if you see actually a lot of Muslim communities in Europe, a lot of organizations, they receive funding from the Middle East, from Turkey, because they can't get funds or money from governments or from European institutions or from public tenders because governments and the European Union and others are worried to support anything that is on the issue of integration of Muslims or around supporting Muslims to combat Islamophobia because it's seen as politically toxic. So that's allowed these other countries to come in and to benefit from that. And I think that's what I was trying to say in my intervention, that actually the fact that the continued inaction and the lack of policies and support to marginalized community allows other countries to come in and take advantage of the situation and then benefit, and allows them to then be able to further their own geopolitical aims and their own aims and objectives, to the detriment of the European Union.
Yeah, you were mentioning that one way through which you work with domestic parties is changing the narrative toward a more security-focused framework of discrimination and racism. I was sort of wondering whether, in your personal experience, there's any merit in confronting these sentiments with facts, or do you have to approach these parties and people and partisan supporters sort of on a more emotional and politically ideological level?
But I think it is a mix of both. I think you need to see what is the best way to be able to present this information and try to convince people of this real threat. It's not the easiest thing to talk about, and it's much easier to when people are talking about economic issues or the moral issue to reach people. But I think that we can, if we are better in our messaging and, actually, if we understand the problem, we can actually, reach out to people and actually convince and explain to people through facts, but also through emotional messaging about what is happening today in our society and the very real threat that we're seeing in terms of the security threat. And I think, people can also see it in terms of, how we're seeing, we have seen a rise in Islamist extremism in Europe over the last 5 to 7 years. We've seen numerous attacks, and we've seen how actually, communities who have been alienated and isolated, how actually then are vulnerable to, outside interference. So if we can see that when it comes to, for example, the Muslim community, then, how come we can't see the other way around in terms of, people who are supporting, the far right or Eurosceptic political parties also feeling alienated and also feeling vulnerable, and therefore they become very much supportive of the policies of some of these political parties and Eurosceptic member states. So if we can see it on one hand, for me it's always surprising that we can't see it on the other hand, where we see that how political parties are engaging in the same kind of playing on people's fears, isolation, alienation, and coming forward with this racist, discriminatory politics and policy making that appeals to those people. And it's the same thing I would say that as I've worked so long on combating Islamophobia, that people who generally vote for the far right or Eurosceptic parties, and likewise people who fall into the trap of ISIS or Islamist extremism, they don't generally believe in those values. It's just that they've been pulled by the propaganda, by the narrative, by the disinformation, and that these political parties, these movements are playing on people's fears. And we need to see how we can counter that. And it could be facts. It could be on reaching to people's emotions, and it could be through policies that generally make people's lives better. How are we going to, if you look at COVID, what is going to be our economic response? If we continue with austerity measures, if we forget the idea of working together, the issues around Corona bonds or Euro bonds, these are all issues that those kind of policies will have an effect on these issues, because if we don't provide people with the real economic and social support, then people will feel as though they have no option but to go and vote or to go and align themselves with these political parties or movements that are engaging in this racism, xenophobia, and extremism. So we need to make sure that we promote policies that actually bring tangible, real benefits, economic and social benefits, and we promote a narrative that can reach people's emotions and that is fact-based.
Okay, so I see that we've passed the hour mark. I'd suggest that I'll ask one last question, and after which we can wrap it up. I'd like to come back to two concepts that you talked about. One is European leadership. The other one is the sowing of distrust that originates from sentiments of discrimination, racism, and is perhaps propagated by the spreading of disinformation on the internet. So looking to the future, there's a lot of distrust perhaps between the North and South in the European Union right now, a lot of nasty stereotypes going around. How do you think that we could come out of this crisis as a stronger union perhaps, and have a good economic and political response to it in order to overcome these national divisions that sometimes emerge in those meetings?
Well, I think, it's pretty clear for me that we need real solidarity, and we need to see the European Union function as a union. If we are to come out of this in a better position, and at least not in a worse position than we were before. And already you can see the mistakes happening. We saw the failure to respond to the needs of Italy. We saw failures around PPE and and not sharing that sharing resources amongst each other. But we're also seeing it now in terms of the economic response, in terms of the Euro bonds, the Corona bonds, as we've been seeing policymakers discuss. We saw France and Germany put forward a proposal, and now we see a counter proposal coming from particular other member states. And we see that concern happening. If we don't show that solidarity and we don't engage in Euro bonds or Corona bonds, in terms of showing that economic solidarity, acting as a union, then we'll be in danger of making the same mistakes we made in 2008 and the same mistakes we had been making over the past few years. We need to really have a European response led by the European Commission, which provides financial resources and financial support to those who are most in need, and doesn't result in in economic policies that cripple particular member states who are already coming out of one financial crisis. And at the same time, in terms of leadership, in terms of how we need our leaders to start to show leadership in terms of how they address citizens, how they engage with citizens. I've always felt as though politicians and European leaders are too far removed from citizens. We need to see how, as one response, especially after the Corona crisis, is how we can become more accessible to citizens and how we can really relate to the needs of citizens. And that's what I think is going to be very important. And that's what's going to make or break our response in terms of whether we go backwards or we actually come out of this stronger, is how European are responsive. For me, a European response would be collective debt sharing, collective financial support, especially to the countries and people most in need, and providing strong social protection and social measures that will ensure that people's quality of life is still good, and people don't face some of the problems we saw after 2008, the financial crisis. I also saw that there's one point about talking about Islamophobia and not Christianophobia or Hindu phobia or Buddhism phobia. Well, I think the reason why we talk a lot about Islamophobia is that I think if you look at the research happening in Europe, Islam and third country migration, which a lot of that third country migration rhetoric is also linked to Islam, is the issue that is most pronounced or prominent in Europe right now in terms of when we're talking about religious minorities. We see that there's a lot of media coverage about Muslims, good and bad. We see that a lot of political parties have taken up the issue of of the so-called threat and invasion from Muslims. So that's why Islamophobia is more prominent in discussions, and especially in issues that I've been talking about. If you speak with me and other colleagues, we don't really see the same kind of issues for other religious minorities in Europe. Outside of Europe, we have real issues around discrimination against Christians. We do see that, if you want to call it Christianophobia, or in particular countries like Pakistan, you see Hindu phobia or Buddhism phobia, as you mentioned. But in Europe, the main issue that you would see when it comes to religious minorities is the issue of Islamophobia. But outside of Europe, of course, it's a different situation. But we very much see that the spotlight in Europe is on Muslims and how Muslims are impacted.
I think we can close the discussion here. There are no more questions at this point. So I hope you all join me in thanking Mr. Vaiya in making himself available, in giving us this presentation, and engaging in this Q&A session. I know that this is not the easiest format. We would have liked to welcome you in Bologna, and we hope to be able to do that very soon, maybe in the next academic year. Thank you everybody so much for joining.